Hello, my name is Neha Kulshresht. I am Assistant Professor in Indian Sign Language Research and Training Center. I am here with my colleague Sachin Singh, who also works in ISLRTC, that is Indian Sign Language Research and Training Center, as a deaf instructor. We are here to record the module Introduction to Sign Language for the project ePathshala. This module will focus on the deaf culture and would provide information related to deaf community and sign language. My name is Sachin Singh. I work in ISLRTC as sign language instructor. Introduction. The word sign language has wide array of meanings. It often means the use of gestures to communicate when speech is not possible or permissible, meaning it means gestures. Sign language is used in the ways like a traffic policeman use signs. That is all sign. In dance, in communication, in army, these are all signs. In normal everyday conversation, when we do a gesture like thumb up, it means good. Or when we sign victory with V, that is all sign. Or when we do a double-handed heart for love, a person who does not understand sign language can understand all these gestures. The term sign language, also known as signed language, however, has a specific meaning in the study of language, linguistics, and deafness. It refers to a language of the deaf community articulated using hands and facial expressions, and as first or preferred language by the deaf individuals. However, we resist to consider sign language in the League of Languages, primarily due to the fact that it uses different articulatory system. Many of us fail to acknowledge sign language as natural human language, primarily owing to our preconceived notions on deafness and sign language. Since deafness and sign language are intimately tied up, it is essential to understand deafness prior to sign language. Deafness, an overview. On the basis of the religious texts like Rig Veda, Buddha's reformist teachings, Old Testament, Holy Quran, myths, legends, folklores, proverbs, biomedical accounts, philosophical inquiries, educational manuals, cultural texts, etc., our attitudes, opinions, and policies on deafness and sign languages are rooted. In ancient, medieval, and even modern times, deafness has been predominantly conceived as pathological condition that must be eliminated through medical intervention. In ancient, medieval, and even modern times, deafness has been dominantly conceived as a pathological condition that must be eliminated through medical intervention. Alexander of Tralles, 6th century BC, prescribes noise therapy for curing deafness, a practice that persisted until the 17th century in Spain. In the same spirit, other medieval texts prescribe the pouring of various liquids like water, honey, oil, bile of animals, milk, vinegar, etc., into the auditory canal as purgatives. All these practices reflect a social prestige for the hearing enabled, and this translated into a wide variety of measures to treat deafness. To sum up, the hearing majority historically has defined deafness by imagining themselves without hearing. The views on deafness are conceived on the various metaphysical notions associated with the human voice. Such socially constructed set of meanings of deaf is also known as audism. An introduction to sign language. For another 2000 years, sign language had a dark age about its status. In the 18th century, the philosopher Condillac believed that the very basis of thought is related to the gestures. Whitney suggests sign language to be a complete system of expression and is so developed for the use of those who, by lack of power to hear, are cut off from the superior advantages of the other means of expression. Another person, Victorian anthropologist E.B. Taylor, regarded sign language and gesture as components of a universal gesture language and suggested that sign language was more primitive than spoken language or writing. And he pointed to its ability to be universally recognizable, suggested that an original sign-making faculty led to the emergence of spoken language. However, the Milan Conference of 1880 on deaf education, which propounded oralism, shunted the growth of such line of inquiry about sign language. With the onset of the 20th century, Saussurean linguistics, with its emphasis on the arbitrariness and on the primacy of speech, sign language was considered as a mere communication system rather than a language. The sign language remained as a disreputable, poor relation of spoken language for a long time and outside the league of natural human language. Such considerations about sign language percolated as the social meaning of sign language. This attitude persists to this day, even though scientific inquiry on sign language began from the middle of the 20th century. William C. Stokey joined Gallaudet University, the only university in the world for the deaf people at the time, and soon he believed that deaf people were no different from hearing people in their worth as individuals. Further, he was convinced of power of sign language as a prime educational medium and as a language that can make a deaf person both a sharer in general American culture and also a member of a social group with its own self-awareness and pride. Despite his scorn and his skepticism, he pursued a structural analysis of ASL, which eventually led to this groundbreaking monograph, Sign Language Structure, an outline of the visual communication system of the American deaf. He was the first to look for a structure, to analyze signs, to dissect them, to search and for constituent parts. In 1964, Stokey, with his deaf colleagues Dorothy Castelline and Carl Kronberg, created the Dictionary of American Sign Language on linguistic principles, which organized entries according to the elements of signs rather than alphabetically. In 1972, he founded a journal, Sign Language Studies, which later became a crucial and vital forum for the dissemination and discussion about sign language and deaf studies. What are the correlates, modality, and universal similarities between sign language and spoken language? On account of Stokey's monograph, sign language was now accorded its due recognition as a natural human language with a natural structure and organization. The only difference being that it is expressed in a different modality. Consequently, some of the core issues that reinforce the naturalness of sign language came from language acquisition, neuroanatomical studies, and from comparative studies between spoken and sign languages. Across linguistic and cross-modality studies demonstrate that the acquisition of sign language proceeds along an identical maturational time course with identical stages of acquisition and development in both hearing and deaf children. A study on ASL aphasics proves that linguistic function for sign language is mostly the left hemisphere processing and the right hemisphere damage does not result in aphasia. It consequently leads to conclude that the left hemisphere has an innate disposition for language irrespective of modality differences. As we have come to learn more about signs, it is evident that sign languages contain the same underlying principles of structure and organization as spoken languages. Deaf community, culture, and deaf worldview. Stokey's work not only provided a sense of linguistic empowerment that generated a faith in being different, but also led to confront the notions indoctrinated into deaf about themselves and their language. Consequently, It led to the development of a new idiom, that of deafness as a culture. Woodward 1972 sorry Woodward in 1972 established the convention of using a lower and upper case distinction between deaf and capital D deaf. The former are those who do not sign and regard themselves as having a hearing impairment. In contrast, the latter are those who identify themselves as members of the deaf community and are culturally capital D deaf. A group of deaf and hearing people who work to achieve certain goals belong to the deaf community, and the deaf members of that community belong to deaf culture. In today's world, the deaf community is an open-ended community whose membership involves not only audiological deafness but also several other factors. In 1980, Baker Schenck and Coakley show the following avenues for its membership. First, on the basis of audiology, that is audiological deafness, a large number of hearing people born of deaf parents or who know sign language or activists share the sign language, culture and values of the deaf community. Therefore, the audiological avenue does not define membership solely. Second, social. As a culture, it is essential to share and participate in all its social functions and to have a cordial relationship with the other members of community. Third, on the basis of linguistics, since cultural values and heritage are primarily transmitted through sign, its knowledge is essential for membership of the community. Fourth, political. It has become imperative for deaf people to profess political beliefs and agitate on matters that directly affect deaf community. Above all other avenues of membership, the most important of all is one's identification as a member of the community and one's acceptance by the other members of the community. This is called attitudinal deafness. Thus, attitudinal deafness stands as the foundation for all such considerations and entails an understanding, acceptance, and identification with the culture of deaf people. In these different contemporary conceptions about deafness, the only claim that remains constant regarding community membership is the use of sign language. Capital D deaf or small d deaf, viewed as disabled or minority. With the increasing campaign by the small d deaf and capital D deaf people for equality and full participation in all spheres of social life and human rights, the two newer constructs, deafness as a disability and deaf as a linguistic minority, emerged at the forefront. The physiological model of disability finds persons with impairment abnormal, disabled, and ultimately handicapped in fulfilling social roles. Such a view reinforces deafness as a disability and ultimately as a handicap rather than a culture. The social model of disability, on the other hand, conceives that disability is produced by the way in which societies fail to accommodate natural aspects of difference between people rather than by impairment itself. Disability, therefore, is caused by material and cultural forces, social structural forces like industrial capitalism, and cultural forces and ideas that shape disability labels and social roles. Deafness as a culture disregards the disabled non disabled distinction and favor the linguistic minority status. Besides the demographic facts that validate the capital D or small d deaf as a minority vis-a-vis the hearing population, deaf people have been subject to oppression or discrimination by the hearing with respect to their values, culture, language, educational ideology, and the access to education. Since sign language has been subject to oppression and their culture and values have been suppressed, they qualify as a linguistic minority. Since the membership in the language community is usually not inherited from one's immediate environment, the sign language is subject to unique social linguistic factors. Moreover, the exposure of the deaf child with other signers through deaf schools and clubs vary. There exists a continuum of sign use both in terms of lexis and structure even within the same generation. Sign language in connection to linguistic human rights and endangered language. It is evident that from the above that no linguistic community reveres its language and language play greatly as a deaf community, since it ensures the participation of the community in the social processes. Hence, for the deaf community, the recognition of sign language is the fundamental to guarantee equality, fraternity, and freedom. In other words, sign language is a linguistic human rights, essential for the sustenance of a dignified life. The deaf's linguistic rights are, however, violated at both the individual and the collective levels. In most countries, sign language is forbidden for deaf education, and deaf are subjected to acquire a spoken language. Such efforts violate the deaf individual's right to have an identification with sign language and to have that identification respected by others. In other words, it is an infringement of the right to learn and the right to use sign language. The eugenic movements derived out of the pathological view proved an exercise over the individual will, belief, culture, and consequently became to prove an obstacle in the empowerment of deaf community. At the collective level, the deaf constitute a minority community, therefore it entails the right to enjoy and develop sign language and to establish educational institutions with control over curricula and medium of instruction. Apart from the violations of the linguistic rights, sign language continues to be neglected in the discourse on endangered languages. It is important to note that sign language lacks traditional transmission and ad hoc criteria accepted to measure language endangerment with respect to spoken languages. Indian deaf community. The deaf population in India is about 14 million, according to Dr. Vasishtha in 2001. And Indian Sign Language is used by 5 million people. The Indian deaf community is primarily based in the urban areas. Indian deaf community. The deaf population in India is 14 million, according to Vasishtha 2001, and Indian Sign Language is used by 5 million people, according to Vasishtha 2014. The Indian deaf community is primarily based in the urban areas where deaf schools, clubs, and organizations are located. The Indian deaf community is primarily a cultural minority bound together by use of sign language and deaf cultural values rather than by other primordial values. They are organized through deaf clubs and associations. In India, it is evident that the provisions for the deaf provided under the Disability Act as well as for minority status have failed to ensure their empowerment. It is imperative to mobilize the deaf people and to politicize the deaf world so that the deaf culture and perspective can be heard in a democratic way, so that the society may come to guarantee them their rights as citizens. Indian Sign Language and its varieties. Within the superstructure of Indian deaf community, there are several regional communities whose study is yet to be undertaken. Of the 14 million deaf population of India, all the members of the population do not sign or share deaf culture due to a variety of rhymes and reasons. Within the deaf community in India, a continuum of sign language use exists due to several socio-linguistic educational factors ranging from Pidgin Sign English using the Indian Sign Language lexicon and English grammar structures, ASL and BSL signs and structures to the indigenous Indian Sign Language. Several claims have been made so far about lexicon and grammatical structure of Indian Sign Language. For example, by Vasisht, Woodward and Wilson in 1978, Vasisht, Woodward and DeSantis in 81, 85, 86 and 87, Jepson in 1991 and Zishan in 2000. In the recent times, there are few studies on different regional sign languages of India. In the recent times, there are few studies on different regional sign languages of India, like Wolong in 2010, Hidam in 2010 and 2014, Panda 2014 and Sinha 2003 and 2013. To conclude, in this unit we examine the social meaning of deafness based on the religious, social, linguistic and political reflections on deafness and sign language. An account of Stokey's pioneering work is highlighted to showcase its significance. With the emergence of new idiom, deafness as a culture, and the capital D and the small d deaf community redefines itself as a disabled, as a linguistic minority, and acknowledges sign language as their linguistic human rights and as an endangered language. Finally, an introductory note on the Indian deaf and capital D deaf community and Indian Sign Language is provided as an impetus to explore the structural properties of sign languages in this course.